Hello, everybody. I'm Ciara Emery. I am the Local Government Stakeholder Engagement Manager for RWE.
Hi, my name's Erik Peckar. I'm the Director of External Affairs for Vineyard Offshore.
So just a little bit about me. We're going to talk about the RWE Canopy project first. Erik will then introduce himself, and we'll talk about both developer projects in the region. So again, I'm the Local Government Stakeholder Engagement Manager. I lead all of RWE's local engagement activities. I am a Cal Poly Humboldt alumni, as Dawn said at the time it was HSU. I did my bachelor's in poli-sci, did my master's in social science in conjunction with Schatz Energy Research Center, and I see a lot of professors from my time there, so it's wonderful to see you all again. Around the time that I completed my master's degree, which did have a focus in the sociopolitics of offshore wind energy generation, I joined Congressman Jared Huffman's team. I worked with him for about 5 years in Humboldt, Del Norte, Trinity, and Sonoma counties, handling his constituent engagement, but also some of his offshore wind efforts. I joined RWE about a year ago. We've got other colleagues in the room as well. Jody, if you could wave your hand. That's Jody Himango. She's our community engagement organizer. We have Carly Ann Johnson, our permitting manager, and Joel Southall, our environmental affairs manager. Any of those colleagues are super happy to talk to you about any additional questions that we might not get to today. And Erik, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, how you doing? Erik Peckar from Vineyard Offshore. I want to thank you all for inviting us here to present today. I think it's just been some really engaging discussions. I'm really pleased that the community is having these conversations really early. And a little bit about myself. I moved out here. I'm not local. I'm a new person here to California. I'm an outsider, so to speak. But for the last 20 years or so, I was living on Martha's Vineyard, a community that had been engaged in offshore wind development since the early 2000s. And I had been working previously the last 14 years with a nonprofit on the island of Martha's Vineyard. And the goal of that nonprofit initially was we wanted to build an offshore wind farm that we owned all as a community. And the story evolved, and we ended up partnering with an offshore wind farm developer, Vineyard Wind. So I've sat in y'all's space for many years, working with offshore wind farm developers, working with my community, ultimately to bring benefits from offshore wind to the island of Martha's Vineyard. And so right now, the project that I'm working on is that I worked on previously, is producing electricity. And it's under construction, and we were able to secure a lot of really amazing things for the island of Martha's Vineyard, which I can talk about. This is me hanging out on the harbor. We did a little tour with Sebastian, that's my girlfriend, Keely. So just having fun out there. And when I do come up here, I do like to stay at hotels close to the harbor. And I do like to swim, so I just want to apologize if some of my DNA shows up in any later studies. That striped sea bass might have been me from the East Coast. So I'll pass it back. Oh, one other thing I just want to be really clear of. Us and Ciara and Vineyard Offshore, RWE, Vineyard Offshore, Ciara and Erik, we work really closely together, but I want to just say we are two distinct companies, two distinct developers. So just want to set the framework there for folks that, sorry? Okay, cough, pardon me. So we're two distinct companies, two distinct developers, so just want to just set the framework there for folks.
So speaking of distinction, I represent, again, RWE, which is the Canopy offshore wind farm. We chose Canopy as just a nod to the region's redwoods. Our lease is 0561, Vineyard's lease is 0562, and Erik will talk about that. The lease is about 20 to 30 miles offshore, and it has, we believe, the potential to power about 600,000 homes in California. The thing that I really like to kind of take a step back and talk about is the journey that we have been on, which in some ways has been long and in some ways has just started. So As it has been alluded to, there was an auction in December of 2022. That auction was held by the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We call them BOEM for short. That auction was a competitive auction that had a couple of steps that came before it. So in 2016, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the federal government joined forces with the state of California to develop an intergovernmental task force to consider what renewable energy development off of California's coast might look like. Out of that intergovernmental task force, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management created what's called wind energy areas. Those wind energy areas and BOEM's process followed some public comment periods, followed a discussion with state and community leaders, tribal officials, and others about the creation of these wind energy areas. Those wind energy areas were the precursor to the 5 leases that you now have off the coast of California. Us and Vineyard signed those leases in June of last year. And I know this community has had several discussions about offshore wind energy development for a long time, especially given the role that the Redwood Coast Energy Authority has played in thinking about what Humboldt's renewable energy future might look like. So I know that this community has had these conversations for a while. RWE and Vineyard are new participants in those discussions as we became the official leaseholders in June. Now, what does it mean for us to have a lease? It means that we have permission to ask for permission to do survey work. So I think you've heard from a lot of speakers today about the process, and we do have this slide that we've sort of formatted what you saw earlier from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I think it was Cindy at CDFW who had the BOEM graphic. But this is a graphic that we developed that we think sort of encapsulates the process a little bit better. So we are in a 3 to 5-ish year site investigation stage. Again, leases only mean that we have a relationship with the federal government and we can go to them and say, hey, we'd like to do survey work. So I just want to highlight a couple parts of this process here. And again, this is about a decades-long development process. Construction is slated right now, if we go through survey work and permitting and community engagement and get to a place where we're actually going to build something, that would occur maybe in the mid-2030s. So a 10-year development timeline, we, again, are guided by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Concurrently, there is a process that Arnie highlighted very well, so I won't stick on it, from the California Independent System Operator and the Public Utilities Commission. They are engaging on a transmission planning process. One of the graphics that Arnie used earlier was new information that was released this month from that transmission planning process. Again, that is guided by the state. Eventually, that will lead to another transmission developer who will be grappling with what transmission might look like. And then there is also, throughout the life of this process, continuous government-to-government consultation with tribal nations and continuous engagement from RWE with tribal leaders as well. What is not up here, which we will get into later, is port development. So in the meantime, and I'll leave it over to Erik, we are hoping to do site investigation. We are in this site investigation period. Site investigation really determines what kind of technologies we might be thinking about, what kind of anchoring technologies we might be thinking about, what we can build, and where we might be able to build it within the lease site. And we're also doing community engagement. Jody over there is doing a lot of work in the community. We have a $10,000 a year commitment to donate to Food for People, among other local charitable contributions. We're very committed to being a neighbor in the region, and that's what we're focused on in the next several years. So we really want to hear from you. What are the needs, wants, and concerns, and how can we spend this long amount of time that we have together collaboratively? And I will leave it over to Erik.
Thank you, Ciara. Yeah, understood. Really quick, I just want to introduce a couple of my teammates. Laura Nagy, she's the lead permitting director for Vineyard Offshore, and we also have Lucia Ordonez, who's our fishery liaison here. So I'll go through these slides as quickly as I can. So Vineyard Offshore, we have a current project here, Vineyard Wind 1. Again, this is the island that I moved here from last June. Vineyard Wind 1 is the first commercial scale offshore wind farm project under construction right now here in the United States. There's actually a group of around 50 folks from Humboldt County that we're flying out through the Humboldt Economic Development Council in about a week and a half to meet with a lot of folks on the East Coast that have gone through this process, elected officials, stakeholders, tribal nations, to listen and learn about some of the experiences for this project. And then separately, we, as Ciara said, we have this lease area out in California, and then a couple other lease areas on the coast in New England and off the coast in New Jersey. So offshore wind farm development has been happening on the East Coast for over a decade, in Europe for 35 plus years, and now things are shifting out here to the West Coast. So this is a new market. I want to talk a little bit about Vineyard Wind 1. Again, this is the first commercial scale offshore wind farm under development here in the United States. It's an 800 megawatt project. A lot of numbers are being thrown out today. 800 megawatt. Arnie did a really amazing job, talking about the carbon offsets and timing. I just want to put something in perspective. We're using 13 megawatt machines. These are around 800 feet tall machines. One rotation of a blade can power your house for 1 to 2 days. So we're talking about an amazing amount of potential energy off of our coasts that are near load centers. This is around 15 miles south of Martha's Vineyard. There's two cables that are, essentially the wind blows offshore. The power is all collected at an offshore substation. There's cables that connect the turbines together, and then there's two cables that run from the offshore substation to a substation here on Cape Cod. So there'll be a similar thing happening here when our projects ultimately would be developed. And then there's an operations and maintenance facility here on Martha's Vineyard. This is the one thing we talked about, community benefit agreements. We wanted job training. The project committed to having an operations and maintenance facility on Martha's Vineyard. Positive thing. Construction's happening here in New Bedford. So a couple different ports. And I'd say hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in these ports, port upgrades as well. And I do want to mention that this project has a couple historic firsts for us from a community's perspective, and my company does, and we're really proud of. One, the company is the first company to sign a community benefit agreement in the entire U.S. offshore wind farm industry. That happened in 2016. And then we recently announced the first tribal community benefit agreement with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. And I just want to recognize also that we have the Wampanoag tribe, Gayhead Aquina, that is out here in Massachusetts. There's two federally recognized tribes in Massachusetts, which is to say that our company, our project, has experience working with federally recognized tribes and non-federally recognized tribes. And we've been having a lot of discussions here, and we'll continue to have discussions here with the tribal nations in this region. A little bit about our lease area, no bumping up against the time. We have an office in Eureka. I want to just mention too, importance of tribal nations. We're going to be announcing in the next couple weeks, the first local hire here is going to be our tribal nation lead. She's a local woman here from a local tribe, and we're really proud of that. So we're really excited to be able to bring her on. So we're making an announcement here soon, but just want to give folks a heads up on that. We do have an office in downtown Eureka. We have, when I say we, RWE and Vineyard Offshore, we have an agreement with Humboldt County on workforce development. So that's something that we're working on. We're in close conversations with the county. And the California has a large goal of, Arnie mentioned this, 25 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2045. So just in comparison, the Vineyard Wind project, this is an 800 megawatt project, offsetting, powering 400,000 homes, taking 325,000 cars off the road every year. So we translate that into 25 gigawatts. That's around, 25 of the Vineyard Wind project. So multiply that out. So I'm just saying that, just want to put that in perspective, how much renewable energy is being produced and how many homes can be powered in California. We're talking the millions of homes, and so very impactful. So some takeaways, as Ciara said, we're looking for opportunities to partner with folks in the community. We're here to listen, we're here to learn, we're here to engage. And as I mentioned before, our project will provide a lot of clean renewable energy, and there's a lot of lessons learned on the East Coast. We are new here. We're gonna make mistakes, but we're gonna take a lot of those lessons that we learned from the East Coast and try to apply them here, and to bring the best project that we can with the input of the community, and make sure it's a project that we can all be really proud of. And also, we love seafood, so if anybody wants to invite us to eat some oysters anytime, or shellfish, or mussels, or corn, it's not seafood, but we're happy to eat.
So Kristen is actually, we've collected questions around the room. Kristen's going to ask questions. And
great. Thank you. We received about 10 comments and just wanted to acknowledge that about half of those were related to the same topic. So I'm going to condense those into one, but it sounds like they'll be available for questions after if you want to get into specific details. So the first question, which is related to most of the comments we got, can you speak to the recent resolutions from tribal nations and what are you doing to address their concerns?
I could go first. I really appreciate that question. I think it's a really important question for us. I think it's important to understand that we're a new industry here, and building trust with communities takes a lot of time. And recognizing that there's been industries that have come into this region previously, and folks have been unfairly treated in a lot of these processes. So I think it's a really good opportunity for us to recognize that, and to name that, and to turn the page, and to start building relationships here at the ground level. And we're really interested in doing that. And there's a lot of opportunities for folks to be involved. As an example, we are the developers on the West Coast. There's a conference next month. We are going to be sponsoring some scholarships for tribal nation individuals to potentially come to that conference in Sacramento. And we're working with the county to provide, transportation and hotel costs as well. So if anybody knows any tribal nation individuals that would like to participate in that, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And we're also advocating that resources come into this community, whether it's our companies or from the federal government or from agencies. You know, we understand and we hear that the tribal nations are looking for resources to be able to participate. And so we're trying to respond to that as quickly as possible. And we just want to say we hear you.
I'll just add to that. We are engaged with the 5 tribal nations who have written resolutions, and we are engaged with the 22 tribal nations that we are that are on our lists from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Native American Heritage Commission. Those tribal nations have been clear with us that they want us to continue to engage with them as we have project development updates, as we collect data, as we figure out collaborative opportunities to work together. The other quick thing that I think is really important to remember, right, is that these kinds of resolutions and the activities of tribal councils are activities of sovereign nations. And those sovereign nations are engaging with the federal government quite extensively. The federal government, through Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, was in town this month. They did a roundtable engaging with these tribal nations where they heard a variety of concerns. So it's really critical for the federal government to do more. It's critical for us to be very thoughtful and collaborative in our engagement. And again, we have the time to do that.
Okay, another question. Can you address noise impacts to marine mammals from construction and turbines, such as change to feeding or migration patterns?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I think somebody mentioned earlier the use of bubble curtains. So maybe I can go back and kind of talk about some of the experience on the East Coast. And these are kind of very different projects and different technologies, so it's maybe not one for one. And why those are different is because on the East Coast, we're using monopiles. These are fixed foundations. The East Coast, we're talking it's 100 feet of water. Out here, we're talking about thousands of feet of water. So on the East Coast, we did use monopiles, or we did use bubble curtains, pardon me. It was a local company that was started up in New Bedford. So again, one of these kind of opportunities for local economic drivers. And the bubble curtains, essentially, it creates sound attenuation. We worked with the federal government where we were only able to pile drive during a certain season. So when there were in particular the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale in the area. We weren't able to pile drive during the seasons. I think it was from like November to April when they're migrating through. And then also we have protected species observers on all of our vessels, and we have guard vessels around basically the construction zone around each of the pile driving activities. So that's kind of the main, when we talk about noise in the water, that's the main piece that I think a lot of us in the industry really focus on and really look at, and really are really looking to solve this problem and to work with our partners to be able to create really good standards so we're not intruding on any marine life.
I think Erik answered that great.
Okay. What have we learned from East Coast wind projects in terms of impacts on birds and marine mammals, and how to mitigate those impacts, not including the ones you just...
Yeah, it's a really good question too. Again, the offshore wind industry here in the United States is just picking up. So each of these projects is going to have to go through an environmental impact statement done through the lead agency, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is under the Department of Interior. So again, Ciara mentioned Deb Holland was out here. She's the Secretary of Interior. So she runs essentially the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So a lot, what happens is when we don't officially have projects yet. I mean, Ciara talked about how we're in very early stages. Once we get to a phase where we are going through project design, we're going to submit a construction operations plan, which we're a handful of years away from doing that. And then once that construction operations plan is submitted to the federal government, that's when the federal government writes what's called an environmental impact statement. Somebody asked a question about engagement, I think in the state processes, but also in the federal processes. There's going to be multiple opportunities for the community to engage, and we're going to want everybody to essentially to write into these processes, to be as engaged. And I think you all as a community are really ahead of the curve in your engagement. I mean, having something like this is really awesome. So I think that folks seem to be very engaged now. I think that's really positive, and there's going to be continuing opportunities for folks to engage as the timeline goes on, and as these construction operations plans get written, and as BOEM essentially evaluates the impacts, positives or negatives, on throughout the different through the environmental impact statement process. I hope that answers the question.
I'll just quickly add that the site investigation phase that I alluded to earlier, again, is really important when you think about no technological decisions have been made until you understand what's happening on the seafloor, what are the kinds of materials, where could you put anchors, what kinds of anchors, and that makes a determination of how you put in technology and what those impacts are. The other thing I'll say is that there is a robust offshore wind industry in Europe. We own and operate 1,000 turbines overseas through the life cycle of the project, which is about 30 years typically. So there's a lot of long-term data on how these projects operate, in other parts of the world, and it's really incumbent upon us to make sure that we're collecting that information and communicating it, and also supporting additional research in this exploratory phase that we're in.
Okay, last question, if you could just answer this really briefly, since we're running out of time. What are some of the unknowns that you think are the most important to address?
Well, this sort of piggybacks off of what I just said. The existing data of what is happening on the seabed in some of these sites is not to the level that we even need to understand what kind of technological decisions we're going to make. So part of the effort that we're going to embark on in our survey work is understanding what is happening offshore, what are those materials, and again, feeding into those technological decisions. So I would say that phase is key to understand what questions there are, what we do know from other technologies and other markets, and what sort of research we need to support to make sure that something is appropriately built for this region.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add to that. I think the biggest unknown is what our projects look like. And as Ciara said, there's going to be some geological survey processes that are happening ahead of time. And somebody smart once told me is that, we don't necessarily choose our foundation. The foundation chooses us based upon, what the seafloor, what the subsea floor looks like. We know some kind of round things. We know we're going to be using floating technology. We know it's going to be tethered to the seafloor. But there's a lot of pieces, the smaller pieces in between that what type of technology, what turbine manufacturer we're going to use, what type of floating foundation we're going to be using. And all of that essentially, impacts a lot of things. What's the pricing eventually going to be? What's the workforce development going to look like? How are we going to get there? So we're not at a place where it's kind of the good and the bad. You know, we don't have a project yet, so we're still in the process of being able to shape what the project is going to look like, which takes a lot of input from the community and a lot of impact from, say, tribal nations, fisheries, and other stakeholders. And then we'll be able to essentially, you know, keep diluting or distilling as we go to be able to once we get to the end game, we'll be able to essentially have our project and really understand a lot of what the unknowns are at this point.